This is a nice follow-up actually to the presentation that Amy just gave, because she talked a lot about her metadata work. And so she mentioned the grant. So again, my name's Arran. I'm the Fedora program manager. Paige is with me here today to talk about the grant work that they undertook. So the two pilot partners have been collaboratively working on this IMLS grant, the Fedora Migration Paths and Tools, a pilot project for about the last 2 years. Amy Blau was the lead from the Whitman team. Unfortunately, she's not here with us today, but I can see her, so I'm waving. You can't see me maybe, but and our other pilot partner institution was the University of Virginia, and the project lead there was Robin Rugaber, who isn't able to join us in person, but I have her notes, so we'll be able to go through the stuff there. Awesome. So the grant we are here to share and talk about is like I said, the Fedora pilot or migration paths and tools, a pilot project. So it was awarded to the DuraSpace Community Supported Programs Division of Lyrasis to help fund the development of tools and pathways along with all of the corresponding documentation, and to help aid in migrations from Fedora 3 to Fedora 6 specifically. So it was originally proposed as an 18-month project, which started in September 2020, I believe. And last year we were granted an 18-month no-cost extension to help complete outstanding work that fell off schedule, just due to things like global pandemic and a few things falling behind. But the grant was specifically focused on Fedora 3 to Fedora 6 migrations. And again, our two pilot partners here were University of Virginia and Whitman College. And then the program team at Fedora, which originally would have been David Wilcox, the program manager, and Danny Bernstein, who was the technical lead at Fedora. And there was also support from the team at Born Digital, who was there to support Whitman through their migration. And everybody collaboratively helped get through this. So the purpose of the grant and the purpose and goal of this project was, so we know that the majority of our Fedora instances are on Fedora 3. So it's one of the most widely used versions of the software. And because Fedora 3 is technically end of life, it puts the accessibility and the security and functionality of these repositories at risk. So we need to get those people out of 3 and into, the most modern supported version, which is Fedora 6. So we needed to open up the pathways and lower the barriers to migration, because as we all know, they're costly, expensive, and resource heavy. So to get people out of Fedora and get them moving ahead. So prior to this grant, there was a planning grant that went into kind of researching what was needed to get people out of 3. And what was determined from that grant was that there was a need for comprehensive documentation as well as tools to make the process itself easier. So the goal and purpose of this grant was to actually pilot these 2 migrations and at the 2 institutions, and make publicly available all of the documentation and all of the tools that were created, and give the community back the resources they needed to move ahead. So we compiled all this into a master document, which I will talk about in a moment, which is the migration toolkit. And this toolkit will kind of act as the guidebook for getting folks forward. So the grant itself was broken down into 3 phases. Phase 1 was to actually pilot the migration. So this involved establishing project plans for each team, and then start to document everything along the way. So from this came some really great resources that Amy mentioned earlier and Paige is going to talk about. And so everything started getting written down on paper. Phase 2 was involved making improvements. So once things started to, people started to test things out and we were running through it, updates to the tooling that was created, updates to the documentation. There were some bug fixes, performance optimizations, things like that needed to happen. So that's what was a big chunk of phase 2. As well, David was instrumental in kind of constructing and outlining what the migration toolkit would look like. So he started to draft that so that we could finalize it as we were going through. And then phase 3, which is where we are now. So we're not entirely complete. There's a few pieces left of the grant, but this was to finalize the toolkit, distribute it to make it publicly available for folks to use, And then ideally hold a migration camp or some sort of in-person workshop to help folks get through it. So last month, I released the first draft of the migration toolkit for community feedback. So we were looking for edits, things that weren't working, links that are missing, things that weren't there. Theoretically, it closed for comment on the 29th. However, if I have the link to the document, it is still open for comment. So it's not too late to provide that feedback. But the other part to it was that originally it was proposed to host an in-person camp to do migrations. But in light of things that are happening obviously around the world and with some different factors, it is looking more like we may be creating some sort of digital content. It's a little more evergreen, but it also gives us the opportunity to make the content more accessible. So if we're recording it and making it, live as digital content, we can provide transcript, we can potentially provide language translation. Folks that are overseas and not in a time zone specific to us can access that material whenever they need it, whenever they're ready. So, as much as we would have loved to do in person, there's also opportunity to make it more easily accessible for everybody. And I'll just make a note, you can see most of the timelines are crossed off and redone in our timeline here, but things take time, and when you initially lay out the plan, as we try to stick to it as best we can, but things like COVID and continual reevaluation of the scope of work at each step, we had to make some adjustments. So we're getting close to the end of it now, and I'm excited to see the finish. So I'm going to pass it over to Paige.
All right. So at Whitman, we were previously hosted on Islandora 7 and using Fedora 3. And so at the time of our migration, we had about 9,000 objects in our repository Arminda. This was mostly, it was from our 6 main collections. They consisted of honors theses, oral histories, archival collection, and then museum and gallery collections. And so, as Amy said a little bit ago, we had a variety of different objects in all of our collection. They consisted of images, binary file, audio, video files. We had a large set of objects, as Amy said. And so basically what we did is that for this project, we started off with a metadata remediation. And so once we did our metadata remediation, then we worked with our partners on the grant, which were Lyrasis, Born Digital, and Alan Stanley, and together build a new site for us, as well as migrate our content over into Islandora 8 or Islandora 2.0. And so to help us with this, we created a series of questionnaires based on our Islandora 7 site. And these were questions about collection setup, object displays, and content models. And basically, the reason for these questionnaires was to really make sure that Islandora 2.0 functioned as close as possible to our previous Islandora instance, because that was one of our main goals, to make sure that when we migrated, we maintained as much functionality as possible, but also to migrate our content that already lived in Islandora 7 into Islandora 8. So through this process, we had a series of successes. And sorry if you hear paper, I have paper. But we had a series of successes. The first success is that we are currently live on Islandora 8. As you look at our site now, it looks very close to what we had in 7. And so we definitely consider this a success. Our collections are structured the same way they previously had been. So again, this is a success for us, especially because when our users go onto our site now, they don't see anything different, so that's awesome. We also were able to migrate over through using Workbench and Google Spreadsheets. And this was a success for us because the majority of our content lives on spreadsheets. And so it's awesome that we can use something that uses spreadsheets. And then lastly, another success that I wanted to mention is that we were able to pull our various objects over from Islandora 7 and put them into Islandora 8. But also we were able to pull out of our Amazon bucket and put into Islandora 8. And this is a success for us because not all of our content is open access. We have a series of things that are limited access. And so it was good to know that we could maintain the level of access control that we promised our users. And so that was definitely a success for us. And so of course, through this whole experience, we had some challenges. As Arran said, there were things about, development delays on the sites. We had a lot of troubleshooting regarding Workbench and storage. In Islandora 8, currently there is no book viewer. And so we had to work around, some of our objects use book viewer. And so we had to kind of find a workaround to that. Also other things that were challenges, including oral history migration or migrating oral history objects and VDT files, setting access controls at object level, and search speed. Now, I say these things as challenges for us, but that does not mean that they're going to be challenges to other people as they migrate into Islandora 8, because we were really the untested test people. And so there's a really good chance that as other institutions migrate into Islandora 8, all these issues will probably be smoothed out. And so I just wanted to definitely mention that. So don't be afraid about what I say. And so, of course, throughout this experience, we have a couple of recommendations that we would recommend. The first one is to prepare your metadata ahead of time. It's so much easier to migrate clean metadata than it is messy metadata, especially because if you plan on cleaning your metadata once you move into Islandora 8, it's challenging because you're not only trying to figure out a new system, but in my experience, I don't have programming knowledge, but in my experience, when editing metadata directly in Islandora 8, it's very manual. And so definitely would recommend preparing your metadata ahead of time. Also, we recommend be willing to compromise when it comes to your functionality. Islandora 8 is something that's brand new, and so it's not going to have the same functionalities as your previous site or your current site. And so just be mindful that you're going to have some compromises there. And so kind of tying in with our last recommendation, communicate and documentation, it would be a really good idea to sit down and list all the current functionalities that you have, be them big functionalities or small functionalities, and really be clear and communicate with either your vendor who's migrating for you, or whoever is involved, and to communicate and say what functionalities are necessary for you to go live and what functionalities can wait a little bit longer, because either way you're going to have to compromise in functionality. And then lastly, talking about our recommendations, communicate and document is really important. As I said, Islandora 8 is brand new, and so it's a really great idea to talk and communicate with everybody. Talk and communicate with everybody, but especially the people who are setting up your site, asking questions about how to create collections, how to ingest items, how to fix metadata. It's really great to ask all these questions and communicate with them, and then create documentation, because you really want to set yourself up for success. And so with that being said, I'll hand it back to Arran.
Thank you. So I'm just going to briefly go through the notes from Robin about their migration stories. Again, it is all documented in the toolkit that is publicly, or the draft version that's available right now. So I'll make sure to give that at the end. University of Virginia was running also a Fedora 3 instance with a custom front end. And so part of the reason that both Whitman and UVA were selected was that for Fedora, they're representative of the majority of our users. So most of the institutions running Fedora are running like an Islandora front end or a custom front end. We do have Samvera users as well, but typically folks are running a custom or an Islandora. So the repository that UVA chose to migrate had approximately, I feel like there's echo, approximately 419,000 objects in it. And they had their object types. They had a collection of photograph collections, digitized text, scalable images, GDMS, and TEI. And I'm just looking here to make sure I got everything. So the reason, their goal was to save this legacy content and reduce the risk going forward. So the repo that UVA actually chose to migrate isn't in production. It was an old repo that they were testing on, that they wanted to do this test using this data set in order to essentially find all the bugs so that when they moved ahead with moving a public facing repo, they would know already in advance what they were looking at. So, so their successes here, the team at UVA in conjunction with Whitman, they were able to create migration utilities, which is actually a framework for physically migrating the content from 3 to 6. And they were heavily involved in the features of migration utils and the performance enhancements that came along with that tool. They were able to spin Fedora 6 up in AWS using Docker. What else they got? They were also helped create the validation utility. So we have migration validator, which will actually confirm and make sure and do checks against all of the migrations to make sure that all your data was moved over and moved over correctly. So that is also available. And so they did successfully move all of their content over, but again, it's not publicly, they're not using it in production because it's not a repo that they needed to have. I'm just going to read her notes here. It says, taking the approach to migrate everything, we encountered performance issues and the need for things like progress reporting. So much like Paige talked about, reporting everything as you go, documenting it for future migrations, right? So really understanding what they were doing in the moment, what wasn't working for them so that come future, they wouldn't run into that issue again. Yeah, I'm going to move on to the next one. So challenges that UVA ran into. So a big part of the issues that University of Virginia had was that they were working with both technology that they weren't super familiar with, the content that was in the repo, they did not have good background information on. It was essentially just old and sitting there. And so that they didn't know what they were working with. So they had limited knowledge of the legacy technology, minimal knowledge of the content, and did not have the physical Fedora 6 hardware requirements. So they were trying to migrate using something that wasn't ideally performant for running Fedora 6. So they also struggled with things like having a fully remote staff at the time. Communication was an issue for them as well. There were some migration hardware choices that were selected that if they could go back in time, I'm sure they would not have done. So that held up things and led to delays. And then trying to migrate over. So they took the migrate everything approach. So they would migrate everything and then find errors and have to iterate and then migrate everything again. So trying to do that delayed their efforts obviously immensely. So their recommendations are to plan in advance, again, much like Paige was talking about, know your content, know what's there, make sure that it's clean and ready to move ahead, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up for a nightmare going forward. Establish your infrastructure requirements up front and make sure that that is clearly laid out and documented so that there are no surprises when you try to go and actually do the migration. And then divide and conquer. So, distributing tasks and roles amongst your team to make sure that everybody's playing a part and it's not falling all on the shoulders of one person. Now on to, I guess, the grant deliverables. I'm just going to talk really briefly about it. I've mentioned it a couple times, but the biggest and probably most important here is the migration toolkit itself. So this is a comprehensive document which includes everything ideally one would need to actually make the move from a Fedora 3 installation to Fedora 6. Within the migration toolkit, there's instructions outlining the preparation, pre-work, migration process for each pilot partner's migration. There is Paige and Amy both mentioned all of the migration or metadata remediation tools that they created. So that is all linked out and available within the migration toolkit. There's templates, there's best practices, there's lessons learned, user stories. It's all linked off of this master document. And then there's links to the tools for actually doing the migration, from the Fedora side. And I'm just making sure that I got everything there. Yeah. So like I said, I released the first draft for public comment. And at this point, it's only been released to Islandora and Fedora communities because we wanted to gather the feedback first so that we can then collaboratively between the pilot partner institutions assess the comments and make sure that they make sense to include them. And then I'll be working with the team at Lyrasis, the graphic design team, to make it in a format that is more easily distributed. Currently now it lives in a Google Doc on someone's Google Drive. And so in order to make this a little bit longer standing and a little bit more official, I guess, if you will, we want to create it in such a way that is, downloadable and easily accessible to everybody. So the goal of that is to this month work on finalizing that piece of the toolkit to make sure that it's available. Other grant deliverables. So these are just the tools. I'll run you through them really quickly here. There's the migration utils, which I was talking about. So this is the actual framework that's used to migrate your data from Fedora 3 to Fedora 6. So what it does is it takes your Fedora 3 FOXML files and it moves them over to a Fedora 6 Oxford Common File Layout compliant structure. So that is the digital preservation piece of Fedora 6. It's the file structure layout, and it's based on the OCFL, or the Oxford Common File Layout specification. And there's a link to, if you want to read more about the OCFL, a link to the specification details at the end. There's the migration validator, which is the command line tool for validating your migration from Fedora 3 to Fedora 6 to make sure that the content is moved over and without error. There is this metadata remediation guide that we've been talking about. So the intensive and comprehensive guide that was created, it has all the tools and all of their templates that you can work from and see and use. And then lastly is the migration guide itself. So these are the step-by-step instructions to get from 3 to 6. And so final steps, I think this is highly representative of, is it working? Okay, yeah. This is highly representative of how we felt coming to the final stages. Is like the finish line was there, and every time we'd meet, it was like inch, and then the finish line was moving also at the same time. But we're super close now, so yeah, we just have to finalize the kit and release it. I talked a little bit about not being able to, or not necessarily doing an in-person migration camp style gathering, but we have been able to give some Fedora migration workshops. So David Wilcox and Danny Bernstein recorded last year. They recorded a virtual migration toolkit, which is available on our YouTube channel. Danny Bernstein and I gave a workshop at Open Repositories in Denver in June that had a whole piece on migrating. I will be at iPres in Scotland in September doing a workshop as well that has a migration component. And we've also been accepted to give another migration workshop at Learn at DLF, which is in Baltimore in October. So that's where you can find us there. And then obviously, the recording of this digital content that we're hoping to create, and then our final grant report. So, and then that will get submitted and published to IMLS. So special thanks goes out to all these folks. I mean, I'm sure there's people, and I apologize in advance to anybody that is not listed here, but these are the folks that were, they did all the heavy lifting. I got to come in at the end and kind of champion the toolkit, and I got to come for the hurrah, but these are the people that were here every day for the last 2 years working through all of this, and they're the ones that are really responsible for the creation of this content, which is super important for us to be able to give back to the community. And just lastly, a slide of resources. So I have uploaded the slides to the Google Doc, the shared IslandoraCon site. I can link it in the chat here if you'd like, but that's the best way to get the most recent release of Fedora 6. There's all of the Fedora communication channels. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Islandora communication channels, but there's some for Fedora if you have an interest in running that. If you're interested in Fedora and how we can work with Islandora, I encourage you to come out to our weekly tech meeting every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. It is truly an open tech call. You can just come and listen. You don't have to bring a topic. You don't have to have a question. We would actually encourage it because we're trying to strengthen that connection between Fedora and Islandora. So we would love to see some Islandora folks at the tech call. And then again, more info on the Oxford Common File Layout if you have an interest in that specification for preservation that Fedora 6 is based on. It's all there. And then this is how to get a hold of all of us. All I have.